if you want a money that no one can counterfeit, then you need to root it in the thing that nobody knows how to counterfeit, which is energy.
That's how you bridge the gap between imaginary magic internet money and the real world. It's in the energy. And anyone that says we can do it without the energy consumption, that's just naive, right? You cannot trust one man with that kind of power or any entity with it. It needs to be something that is unfakeable.
They're changing the rules of the game, right? They're degenerating the game. And that's why ultimately these things end in hyperinflation or warfare or both.
My favorite is men can't get periods. They can print money and give it to people that will tell us men can get periods, and that money is not going to work for much longer. It's going to hyperinflate.
Bitcoin's obviously all about sovereignty, but Bitcoin miner sovereignty sounds like it's being compromised. How do we get Bitcoin mining to adopt more of a traditional Bitcoin ethos?
Weirdly, you need people to suffer as a result of not taking their own sovereignty into mind. Because miners are just increasingly doing what they're told. And this comes right back to centralization versus decentralization. It's not a binary thing, it's a trend. And if Bitcoin is trending towards centralization in mining, that ends in a bad place. It might be all right now, but we know it's getting worse and not better.
Is there any way to avoid this? Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. So Bitcoin mining is definitely where the rubber meets the road in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's very complicated. This is one of perhaps the most complicated areas of Bitcoin. It's the business, right? It's the ruthless capitalistic side of Bitcoin. And one of the best analogies I've heard is that it's kind of like a lottery system where every mining machine is basically generating hashes, which are like lottery tickets. And they're trying to find the winning combination to this puzzle that resets roughly every 10 minutes to win the newly issued Bitcoin. And all of that energy that's poured, we'll call it capital in terms of both the hardware and the actual energy that's poured into that lottery system goes into securing the Bitcoin network so that the bigger and more valuable the network becomes, the more secure it becomes. I would love to hear, because we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive today on Bitcoin mining. It's going to get a little technical, jargon heavy at times. So before we did that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on just kind of like big picture Bitcoin mining 101.
Yeah, so it's an unriggable game. Bitcoin is in general, in theory anyway, and it's quite close to that in practice. I usually use a language analogy where if you want to communicate and you're using a well-adopted language like English, you're going to need to fit the rules of the language as established by its participants. So you can't start speaking nonsense because you're not going to be understood. So in a context of something like English, there's enough people speaking English that it's of your benefit to learn it because it's going to help you. And by virtue of you doing that, you strengthen the overall network of English. And it helps self-reinforce to the point where we have this wonderful thing called English that if we didn't have, we'd be stuck for communicating. Like it's a reliable thing. Even if you're both not English native, you can probably both use English, right? It's a super useful tool. And importantly, when people come along and try and distort it and corrupt it, like change the meaning of words like the woke mind virus likes to do, you can still always laugh at them and you can always reject what they want because you know that there's a billion people that aren't going to accept those rule changes, right? So mining is a process that people will engage in because unlike clown world economy stuff, you don't have rules that can be changed on you, and you can't get rugged by playing along with the rules and then suddenly, no, you don't have that money, or no, you don't own those stocks and shares, or something like that. It justifies an investment of capital and just pure raw electricity cost and the development of more and more efficient machines to come along and say, this network has now placed this insanely high requirement where it's saying, guess a number that on average will be between 1 and 84 trillion. And you've got to, on average, guess that many things. And you're going to burn a lot of electricity doing it. And you're going to have to invest a lot in hardware to do it. But don't worry, if you do it, we're not going to change the rules on you. So go ahead and do it and guess away, guess. And if you get lucky, you get to pay yourself new Bitcoins. And that's an unriggable game, right? And people try their hardest when games are actually worth playing. So that's what mining is. It's imposing a set of restrictions on people, saying, if you jump through these hoops, which we promise will never move, get good at it, and you can pay yourself a lot of money to do it. And by the way, the more of you do it, the harder we will make it. And you have every reason to keep competing in that arena.
That's fantastic. Another, maybe this plugs into what you're saying too, as it being an unriggable game. One of the ways I've put this is that if you want a money that no one can counterfeit, then you need to root it in the thing that nobody knows how to counterfeit, which is energy, right? You can't fake energy. Basically, you have to work to produce it. What is it? What then would you say, the very common critique that's wielded against Bitcoin is that it quote unquote, waste energy. But what you're describing here, I think, is that you need the energy expenditure to make this game unriggable. How do you then counter that common critique that's wielded at Bitcoin that it's wasteful?
Yeah, so that's the fundamental currency of the universe is energy. It can't be used directly as a medium of exchange, right? And it can't really be stored super efficiently either. So, but you can measure consumption of it pretty well. So this is kind of well established in the Bitcoin space that's how you anchor it back to physical reality, is this consumption of energy. Without that, you just have clown world economics, which is people saying there should be this many Bitcoin and that person is corruptible. And that's what fiat is. It's making arbitrary rules and saying there will be this much of it. You can't have an arbitrary thing that's supposed to reflect energy consumption. You have to actually consume it. So that's what makes it unfakeable. That's how you bridge the gap between imaginary magic internet money and the real world. It's in the energy. And anyone that says we can do it without the energy consumption says we can have a worthless currency, like start Bitcoin from scratch with difficulty 0, or they're saying we need to set up some sort of trusted oracle that defines inflation rate and distribution and all that stuff. And that's just naive, right? You cannot trust one man with that kind of power or any entity with it. It needs to be something that is unfakeable. And if I tell you, guess a number between 1 and a billion, and you actually guess the one number I had, I know on average you tried 500 million attempts. On average, that's how many it's going to take you. You can't fake that. You just can't. We can cheat internally if you want, but Bitcoin imposes a system that says those guesses are energy consuming and you can't fake that, right? That's how it does it.
Yeah, and that was the real genius behind Adam Back's proof of work, right? Is that that's what the anti-spam technology is, like make all of these wasteful guesses or just arbitrary pieces of data that are intended to clog up throughput or waste people's storage capacity, whatever it may be, assign a cost to that, and then all of a sudden you will economically defeat spammers, basically. So it sounds like Bitcoin almost leverages the laws of physics in a way.
Yeah.
Like it's trying to piggyback on the integrity of the laws of physics, which so far as we know are unshakable. No one knows how to distort them up until this point in history, at least. And then Bitcoin's sort of like, by rooting in the physical world through energy expenditure, it's adopting or inheriting maybe the integrity of those rules to some extent. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's a social consensus component to it. What are your views on that? Like, is this is this, maybe this is the mind-bending aspect of Bitcoin, that it is this social construct, right? It's software, it's abstract, but it's also very reified and concrete and rooted in physical reality through this bridge of energy. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that, if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, so here's where it gets fuzzy, right?
Mhm.
Because you can start Bitcoin again and just call it like Bitcoin 2 or like
Mhm.
Breedlove coin if you want. But the problem is then you come back to the language analogy, which is if there's only 3 people speaking the language, at that point the rules can be arbitrarily changed, right? It's not, the miners have to jump through the hoops. They have to guess out of this enormously large set. But at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of established decentralized understanding on whether or not they actually met the target or not. So if there's only, and this comes down to nodes, and this is what it's used. Can I use colorful language on
Please,
this? All right. So this is what
freedom above
separates,
all.
this is what separates Bitcoin and shitcoins. This idea of decentralized enforcement of the rules, right? Because you can speak gibberish if you want, but at the end of the day, if you want to be understood, you need to satisfy the requirements of everyone else speaking that language. If there's only 3 other people, you can bully them and you can coerce them into adopting new rules that satisfy your, 51% attack on the language. With English, you just can't do it. And that's not a thing you can fake. You can't magic a language into, because someone could come along with English, right, and say, hey, I've got a better idea for a better language. It uses fewer letters and we get rid of inefficiencies like
it's like Esperanto, right?
Right. There's a K and a C. That's inefficient. We'll just use one of them. Like you have K for the hard sound and S for the soft sound. We don't need C, and we can redefine everything. But if no one speaks it and no one is motivated to learn it, I don't trust any communication in that, because it can just be changed by the small group of enthusiasts, right? So when you meet those requirements as a Bitcoin miner, who are you proving yourself to? When you meet these requirements, is it a broad enough network with a rule enforced in a decentralized enough capacity that it's worth that energy expenditure? And in Bitcoin, it is just about, because there's no such, it's not a binary dichotomy between centralized and decentralized. It's a trend. And it's a thing that you can move towards and you can move away. And there's different pockets of centralization in Bitcoin. But we were naive. Like at the beginning of Bitcoin, we just go, it's a decentralized cryptocurrency, right? But it was pretty centralized, right? There was one developer and he kind of decided what all the rules were, and he slowly disappeared and we trended in the right direction. But the reason you can't just go, here's Breedlove coin, it's a decentralized crypto, is because you're the only one that decides what the rules are. So why am I going to spend $1 million burning electricity to satisfy a requirement that you can change in 10 seconds? That's not going to happen. I need tens of thousands of people at the very, very minimum saying this is what the requirement is, and you can't cheat your way around it. If that is imposed on you, then that starts to become unriggable enough that it's worth you spending the energy, right? That's what I mean by unriggable. So you've got to expand and expand, and you've got to trend in the right direction. And there isn't a cryptocurrency outside of Bitcoin that does the same thing, even on a cultural level. What competing currencies to Bitcoin always do is they want to have some feature that Bitcoin doesn't have. And what that is in the language world is like saying, we'll come up with a language with 500,000 more concepts and words, which is better than English, right? On paper it is. And I'm saying, well, then a 3-year-old can't learn it anymore, and it will be centralized necessarily because only a tiny group of experts will be able to speak it. So feature coins that try to do a thing Bitcoin can't do necessarily never go towards decentralization. They have the disadvantage that Bitcoin already exists and it's eating up all the market for decentralization enthusiasts. And worse, they have an extra feature on top of it, like maybe something like privacy, which obviously we want, but you can't have everything. Or they're trying to do Turing complete smart contracting and stuff like Ethereum and Solana and all that. I'm saying no one can speak those languages. They're not going to be widely enforced. So having a high requirement, a proof of work requirement, is insane, because whoever it is that you're satisfying with that, it's going to be Vitalik and friends, or it's going to be some other Silicon Valley monstrosity, and they will just change the rules on you in 5 seconds. So no one will ever have the confidence to develop ASICs, or, this ecosystem is never going to have the chance to build because it's fiat. It's fundamentally fiat. It's changeable at the whims of people.
Yeah.
Bitcoin just isn't. If you fall out of alignment with the rules of the network, generally you're just going to be left on your own. And there's no one you can directly coerce because there's just too many people.
That's fantastic. It's important to remember that, as you said, even Bitcoin began as a centralized thing, right? It was just an idea in one guy's brain. Then he releases it into chat room, and then it, through an organic path of adoption, it becomes decentralized. So it's not, even when we use these terms, centralized, decentralized, it sounds like it's a binary, but the reality is it's a continuum, right? Like most things in reality. And so Bitcoin has become more decentralized over time. We'll get into whether that is still the case, if it's still on that same trajectory or not, and what indicators there are to see whether it's becoming more or less decentralized. But the other thing I think is really important is you opened up this conversation by calling it an unriggable game. And I think those games that aren't riggable, are the only games that are iterable, that actually are playable in a repeated fashion. Because if you can bend, twist, or break the rules of a game, well, then eventually, sort of two things happen, right? One, the power struggle becomes who gets to control the rule-making apparatus. Because if you can control the making of the rules, then you have the power to win every single round of every single game ever played, right? It's like, if we sit down to play poker and I get to decide the hand rankings every hand, well, then you're never going to beat me, right? My pair is going to beat your royal flush if I happen to flop a pair and you happen to flop a royal flush, because I get to decide the rules. So the game,
you get to decide. There's not 52 cards. There's 58, and
exactly.
I got the extra 3 queens, so I win every time.
Right, exactly. And so the game degenerates it goes from a game, like a peaceful game, to politics or violence, right? People are just basically fighting over who gets to control that rule-making apparatus. And I guess that's the second thing, basically. One is people fight over the rules, and then two, the game devolves and degenerates and ultimately goes away. And I think that's a really good, like, understanding the game dynamics in that way is a really good lens through which to interpret fiat currency and central banking. It's like every time they print money or freeze your bank account or enforce capital controls or deauthorize a currency note, like, they're changing the rules of the game, right? They're degenerating the game. And that's why ultimately these things end in hyperinflation or warfare or both.
Yeah, and it leads to a competency crisis, because I'm not going to become skillful at a game that keeps changing on me. There's no point.
Yeah, what's the point?
I'm just going to try and climb the ladder and be one of the guys that decides the rules. Because then I can decide who the winner is, and I get to be a backroom, the dark architect behind who's on. So it leads to the shitification of everything.
Yes.
I'm not going to practice and become the world's best at something if that thing is not well defined and it can be changed.
Yeah.
I'm just not. So there's nothing worse than like trying really hard and playing your best at a game, and then someone says those aren't the rules anymore. Sorry. Like, you might have done really, like, competency crisis is just DEI is the best example of that. Like, I'm really good at my job, but I'm not in a favored group right now. I'm a white male, or I'm heterosexual, or something like that. That says that's not the rule. Like, the game is how much of a trump card can you play in the oppression Olympics, right?
Yeah.
If you're whatever's in fashion this week, if it's like, if you're this nationality or that sexuality, right now it's transgenderism is like the top of the pyramid for like. So I don't care how good you are when you applied for the Olympics opening ceremony to do your art. You obviously weren't chosen. It was a bunch of transgender people, right? Because they're the popular ones right now.
Right.
So it's not about competency. It's about something else. So if you're the best singer or dancer or something like that, that's not the thing. And that was the game. That's what motivated you to be a good dancer and a good singer or whatever. And you're not going to be where you should be as a result of that. Yeah. And it just leads to like ugly architecture and just no one being good at their job. Everything just becomes crap.
All goods and services degenerate. I mean, it's like, if you're going to have life-saving brain surgery, do you want someone that got there because he performed 10,000 of those surgeries successfully, or do you want someone that got there because they were selected for their race or religion or whatever minority status? It's almost like people have to compete across some dimension for anything, that any role that needs to be filled or anything that's scarce, right? That there's less supply of the thing than there is demand. There's more demand for the thing there is supply, that people need to compete for that. If you're not competing across the dimension of competency, then things just go awry really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's, you use this analogy to language. And maybe that's a good definition for wokeism. Actually, like, it's an attempted 51% attack on language. They're trying to like force the redefinition of words.
Yeah. But this comes back to Bitcoin beautifully, because you have we change the rules every now and again in Bitcoin, right? And you have soft forks and hard forks. Soft forks happen quite often, and they're quite easy to do, because that's the equivalent of adding a new word to English. You can do that, and if it catches on, it catches on.
Right.
Hard forks, which have been what people attempted to do in 2017 and learned pretty quick that that's basically impossible to do without overwhelming agreement.
Yeah.
That's redefining a word that already exists and wanting a billion people to be like, okay, that's the new meaning for that word.
That's good.
Hard.
Oh, so just to define those things: soft fork, backwards compatible upgrade in Bitcoin; hard fork, non-backwards compatible upgrade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if I try and redefine this chair to be like, oh, chair means something else now, that's really hard to do.
That's hard,
and
right?
That's what woke.
Because there's a lot of
language
blocks in the
is.
chain going backwards, where chair equals chair, right?
Yeah. And you need all these people to agree to break an existing rule that their inertia doesn't allow for.
Right.
Like if like, Dominicans or something want to make a new word and add it to English, they can, and it doesn't affect existing English users. Yeah. But if they start literally using this word chair to mean something else, that's really difficult. They actually need us to all cooperate with that change. The analogy is not super watertight.
No, I think it's a pretty strong analogy, actually, because when you do get neologisms, new words in English, they're usually driven by technology. Actually, like we were walking on the beach out here one day. My girlfriend grew up in the Netherlands, and she speaks Dutch. She looked at the light tower. Yeah. Or, I'm sorry, the lighthouse. I'm already confusing my words. And she called it a fire tower. And apparently in Dutch, that's what they call it. They call it a fire tower. And then we got to thinking about it. I was like, oh, that's because when that word was used in Dutch, there was a fire in that tower. And now when we use it in the US, presumably there was an electrical light in there more recently. So new technology actually drives change in our language, like gives us new words, new phrases, and all of these things. And similar would be in Bitcoin, right? Like maybe we get, I don't know, pick an upgrade, Taproot, I guess that was a was that a soft fork?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, it was. Yeah. You can come up with new ideas come around in cryptography, and you can make people can say, hey, I want a new address type, which will encumber coins with certain conditions.
Right.
Like you can have a coin. A very trivial example is check lock time verifier. It's a very old thing that was added to Bitcoin. And it's like, I want to put my coins at an address where they can't be spent from that address for a year. And that means I'm immune from $5 wrench attacks for that whole year. Like someone wants to whack me over the head with it, I cannot spend those coins for another 11 months. Like come back then. And if you want, you can, Fort Knox your house for 1 month a year when you move it to the next check lock time verify, right? And this is also useful for creating Sybil resistant cryptographic identities, right? So if you have coin join implementations like Join Market that are not Sybil resistant, where the same guy can make 1,000 different offers and you might think they're all different people, that kind of sucks. But you can impose a cryptographic cost to creating each identity and saying, I'm only going to use guys that have locked up 10 Bitcoins in a locked UTXO. That imposes a cryptographic financial cost to doing it, right? So, I mean, when we talk about Sybil resistance, it's the idea that you can just create 1 million identities or 1 million nodes on one Amazon web server or something, for example. Imposing an actual financial cost on that, saying you've got to lock up coins for ages, is super useful. And this is a tangent, but that's how Join Market it works, right? It's a decentralized coin join implementation rather than Whirlpool from Samurai and Wasabi's Wabi-Sabi protocol. Like those are both centralized, or they were. Wasabi isn't anymore, and Samurai's gone because of the US government. Yeah. So yeah, like the idea was decentralize it and make there be a cost to it and leverage what Bitcoin is to impose that cost and, make it again unriggable. Like if I lock up a Bitcoin to create a cryptographic identity for join market purposes, there's no unlocking that Bitcoin. I literally cannot access it until the time, it gets played out. And that the amount of time and the amount of size it is, the value of the bond you create is a function of both how long it is and how much Bitcoin there is. So you can create a very expensive identity, and then people can go, I trust that. So super cool concept.
That is so cool. That's definitely going to take that analogy away from this, that soft fork is like adding a new word to English. Hard fork is like trying to break consensus on an existing definition.
Yeah.
And wokeism is very much like trying to hard fork English.
My favorite is men can't get periods.
Yeah.
And they can keep telling us that they can, and we can keep laughing at them forever. And they got a couple of years left. They can print money and give it to people that will tell us men can get periods, and that money is not going to work for much longer. It's going to hyperinflate.
Right.
Like, it is kind of from money. It is fiat. Like, Bitcoin does fix woke. Like, you know, I like that Microsoft fired their DEI department the other day, and they're like, oh, Trump's going to win. This is a waste of time. They just fired them. Like, this is great. We're finally seeing the end of this.
And it speaks to that sort of mind control element of money printing, where like not only is it stealing from savers, but it can also be used to manufacture different narratives, right? Of course. Like wokeism, DEI, whatever. That's something that's not understood well enough either. I want to talk here. So you've mentioned there's a difference though. So we've done kind of maybe a high level gloss on what Bitcoin mining is, but there's a culture in Bitcoin mining that you think is actually different than what is considered to be more traditional Bitcoin HODLer culture.
Exactly, yeah.
Where, you know, in Bitcoin HODLer culture, you often hear phrases like don't trust, verify, not your keys, not your cheese, etc. Right? Very adversarial thinking mantras. But inside of Bitcoin mining, maybe we don't have that level of trust minimization. Could you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, so a brilliant way to posit that. The best example of it would be open source enthusiasm, right? Bitcoin is necessarily open source. No one would use it if it wasn't. We're not
just running, like English, by the way.
Right. Like, we're not using sort of that's really hard to extend the analogy that far, because you have this concept of binaries versus source code that's human readable that you can compile yourself with a compiler that you can compile yourself, and you don't need to trust anyone, right? Like, Bitcoin is compilable, right? And anyone that tells you run a node, if they want to sort of guide you down the right path, they'll be like, here's the source code and here's how you compile it yourself. So you know that, like, I mean, do you understand the difference between like a binary?
No, I want to ask, well, this is interesting because I often analogize when people are like, oh, what is open source software? I invoke natural language or English and say, well, obviously anyone can inspect it, modify it, propose changes, etc. Everyone uses it. No one owns it. It's sort of like a common good in a way. But you're saying maybe that's not an apt analogy because it's not compilable. What does that mean exactly, compilable?
So I guess the only way you can use language as an analogy there is if, like, you go to Saudi Arabia and you don't speak Arabic and you walk around with a translator and everything you say, you tell him because he speaks English, and then he tells them. And you just have to trust that his communication with them is what you meant when you're speaking English. That's no good, right? That's trusted, that's mediated, that's not disintermediated. Like, Bitcoin's supposed to radically disintermediate, like peer-to-peer, not peer-to-bank to bank to peer.
Right.
Like, and if you have those banks, they are like the closed source software of the monetary system, right? That we want to get away from. So how does that tie into? Yeah, so I'm saying you have the source code and you can compile it and turn it into the binary, right? Are you familiar with the concept of what a binary is versus source code? Happy to run through it real quick.
No, please do.
So computers are working with zeros and ones, right? But that's not human readable. And you can't turn that back into the source code, not trivially anyway. That's, so Bitcoin, we don't just have people that compile the source code and then hand us out binaries, because it's impossible to know what the source code was before it was compiled into a binary. You're not a CPU. You need to read the English source code, right? So we don't trust binaries, right? We have the source code, we compile it into binaries ourselves, and then we have some reason to trust that it does what we thought it did, right? As long as we trust the compiler, which is another can of worms. But, you know, in the Bitcoin's written in a very open language like C++. Some modern languages you have more reason to sort of be suspicious about what the compiler gives you versus what the source code was, but that's not there's a reason it's in something like C++. It's long and, you know, holds on to all those values, and you can compile the compiler yourself. You can bootstrap the whole thing, but I digress like massively. I'm just saying there's no trust. So when you're running your Bitcoin node and you're running your rules, you establish the rule set as it was supposed to be, and you can be sure that the software is doing what it's supposed to do, which is essential, right? Because anything else represents a choke point, a period of centralization, and a mediator. Someone like if bitcoin.org or bitcoincore.org, or I forget the website, which has binaries on it, if that was the only place to get it, then hold a gun to the guy that runs that website and make Bitcoin do something bad, and then we're all screwed. Like it has to be something that we can bootstrap from scratch ourselves.
So yeah, trying to minimize the points at which interpersonal trust is required, ideally to the point where you can perceive and verify everything yourself. But of course, for everyone, that's not even possible, right? Even if you compile the what you said, the source code into binaries, well, not everyone can read binaries either.
Yeah,
but
so
these are abstraction layers you're describing, right? Like zeros and ones, then the binaries, and then ultimately somewhere there's an application layer in there. Is that the?
So the binary is just the computer readable version of it.
Right.
But it's just not something that you can look at as a human and go, oh, all right, this does what I expect it to do.
Yeah.
You can't do that because it's just no software developer is writing 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1. Like it's just not how we do stuff, right? I mean, you have the layer above that, it's like assembly code, and then the C++ as well. Like, I don't want to get out on my depth and laugh about it too much because I'm barely a developer, but that's like how computing works, right? Like, and there are varying degrees of trust on it. But I think Bitcoin works and it sort of becomes pragmatic rather than ideological. Most people aren't actually going to compile it themselves. They're just going to run it with some distributed binary. But the fact that people can compile it does enough to make it not worth being a malicious actor. So if you want to really burn your reputation as like the guy that maintains the GitHub repo of Bitcoin and like produce malicious binaries, it'll get found out about pretty quickly because the checksums won't match versus what people are doing. And then they'll go, something's changed, something fishy's going on here, and it will get caught very quickly. So it becomes not really worth lying about it. You might as well hold on to your reputation. So that's not a solid argument against it, but it is a practical reason for why we don't see malicious Bitcoin binaries out there in the wild.
Got it. That sort of resonates with me. Again, I'm not a software developer, but I used to be very heavy in spreadsheet world, and we often use checksums, right? Big elaborate spreadsheets.
Yeah.
As you're building them, can often get errors or formula mistakes throughout, and the checksums sort of help you triangulate where those errors are and clear them out.
It'll give you a big red flag if something changes. That
exactly. Yeah, something's not right in this row or column. This September 5th through 9th, 2024, join me on the Pacific coast of Mexico for our first ever men's retreat, which we are calling The Art of Alpha. In a cooperative training environment at a world-class retreat center, we will be having daily meditations, movement practices, yoga, cold plunging, infrared sauna, lymphatic drainage, massage, heart rate variability training, gut health lectures, all while enjoying an anti-inflammatory diet, free of allergens, and designed for optimal full-body health. The retreat center is a gorgeous biohacker's paradise located right on the ocean. You can think of this place as a nervous system reset facility. At the Art of Alpha, we are seeking men who wish to cultivate freedom, wisdom, sovereignty, physical fitness, truth, and love in themselves and in those who look up to them. If you've always felt motivated to push yourself to new limits, to discover the best version of yourself, but you've struggled to find the right community to immerse yourself in, then the Art of Alpha is for you. You will be training alongside a group of men who have been individually selected for their outstanding self-discipline, virtue, and work ethic. To apply to join the first ever Art of Alpha event, go to breedloveevents.com. And yes, I did say you'll have to apply as we're striving to gather a select group of men for this experience. Again, that's breedloveevents.com to apply to join us for the Art of Alpha on the Pacific coast of Mexico, September 5th through 9th, 2024. The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code BREEDLOVE for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you. Back to the mining culture versus hodler culture.
Yeah, so I went way off track there. Sorry about that. So mining hardware all runs closed source firmware, which is basically as a result of how few companies there are producing mining hardware, puts one company in charge of what everyone's running locally, right? So it's one thing to trust a server without open source software. To be honest, that's kind of going to happen a lot, because even if Facebook open sourced everything that's running on their servers, you don't have any way of knowing that that's what they're actually running on their servers, because that was some of the controversy with Signal, right? Signal's pretty trusted, right? Snowden endorsed it, and a lot of people do, but the source code for their servers was, published, but everyone was like, are they actually running this? It hasn't been updated since 2020 or something. I don't know if that's changed recently, but that's sort of a false sense of security. But locally, if you're a Bitcoiner and you have something on your Wi-Fi network at home and you're expecting it's to do with Bitcoin and you are not allowed to know what it's actually doing, and to add insult to injury, we find backdoors in it that allow the company to remotely shut the thing down or to change the credentials on it, that's completely unacceptable. We would never tolerate that in node land, in HODL land, or even our wallets, right? We need to know what the Trezor firmware is and the cold card firmware. No one's going to use that stuff if it's closed source. That's a joke. In mining land, no one really noticed. No one paid much attention to it. And even the competitors that are better than the main monopoly entity are still all closed source. And even all the jailbreak aftermarket firmware for this stuff, all that's closed source too. And even the people that make custom hardware for it, control boards produced by companies like Epic, even they closed it all up. So basically it's trust. It's not don't trust, verify, because you can't verify it. So that to me is like a window into how mining just differs in approach from what Bitcoin proper culture is. And I need to be careful, because I don't want to insult miners, and they have their own things they have to deal with, like staggering electricity costs and just unbelievable competition, trying to make projections around tradition, what the analog is for mining gold, and being if anyone else mines gold, the earth will algorithmically make there be less gold in the earth's crust. Trying to predict stuff like that's horrible. And it's I had fun with this airplane analogy today. It's I don't know, we'll get to that in a bit. I should probably weave that into some later topic. But mining, this difference in culture, really where it gets ugly is miners are expecting a payout from the blockchain. But if you just wrestle with Bitcoin one-on-one, you're like, I'm a miner, I've got my 10 petahash worth of mining power, I'm just going to point it directly at the Bitcoin network and wait around for 5 years and hopefully mine a block, and if I don't, I get 0. That's not palatable for most miners. That's called solo mining. And what they do is they collaboratively mine and agree to split rewards, which is a no-brainer. It's right, 100 of us, let's all group together. We divide everything by 100, and then we get cash flow, right? And the trouble is the entities that do that have taken on a bunch of the other functions of what mining is and obfuscated nearly the whole process and do it without any transparency at all. So again, that's just an artifact of that culture that it doesn't have this don't trust, verify mantra that's drilled into them. And to make matters worse, that the coordinator of all these different hashes working together to split rewards, they don't provide any transparency in what they do, and they take custody of all new coins as well. So the Mt. Gox lesson of not your keys, not your coins, and all that is another thing that didn't translate. So what ends up happening is miners that want to solve for cash flow end up working with this centralized cartel of people that actually go and deal with the blockchain. They control what goes into it, they control what comes out of it, and they give the miners something. And the miner says, well, I got paid this much, and I have no way of creating any sort of link with what happened in the blockchain, because that's random. Like it's sort of deterministic, in a way where it used to be back when it was 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. You could sort of intuit, right? Well, this was the overall network hash rate, and I have 1% of it, so I should be getting, well, it would be 0.5 of a Bitcoin every 10 minutes. It should average out that much. That's how much I should get. But then that all gave way to transaction fees slowly. That's the theory of it. It hasn't really happened that much yet. But how are you supposed to know if what's coming out of the chain is reflected in what the coordinator is giving you? You can't, because they've gone and they've turned this random thing into a guaranteed payout for you. And that's an insurance product of sorts, where someone's saying, don't worry about the random Bitcoin blockchain that will pay, gosh knows what over the next week. I will pay you this much. Just point your hash power at me and I'll pay you this much. And you just basically get what you get, and you go, I don't know, it sounds right. There's no way to look at the blockchain and relate it, because there's too much obfuscation. And it's a massive intermediary, and it's naturally centralizing as well. And it's kind of like money printing, that feel of once you start, you can't stop.
Yeah.
So miners have become completely addicted to cash flow, where, and getting reliable, regular cash flow from a random thing like Bitcoin's blockchain is a painful addiction, and it systemically weakens everything, because there'll be just this massive lender of last resort that can say, don't worry, if anyone's getting in over their head, because what the pools do is they say, we'll pay you no matter what. If one day we may get twice as many blocks as we expect and have to pay you only half of it, another day we might not find any blocks and be on the hook to pay you $10 million. Someone's guaranteeing that no matter what, you'll get paid. Blockchain's random, right? So your pool might go a week with 0 blocks and you're on the hook for those miners. And the miners are saying, free lunch, great, we get paid no matter what. You can't pay miners money that doesn't exist. It's got to come from somewhere, right? So what happens is you get this mega lender of last resort that says any small pool that gets in over its head will bail you out, will lend you money, and then you also have to do what we say, which is why it starts to feel reminiscent of IMF. And
I was going to say that the metaphor there, lender of last resort, so it just sounds like it's rife for or with corruption, because that's the
like
central bank. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is one of those cases where the miner's desire for really, I don't know if the word's convenience or really good business hygiene in a way. They're just trying to match their revenue and expenses, right? Because they're getting those electricity bills every month that they have to pay. And it's easier to have revenues coming in consistently that cover that rather than feast or famine.
Yeah.
And so they collaborate to mine in pools, but then that introduces this man in the middle kind of risk where you've got, the pool's paying them out, but it's hard to trace back the accounting on that to see if it's being done correctly. What then, you've talked about there being certain advantages where miners can be paid directly from the Coinbase transaction. I guess first, could you define the Coinbase transaction, and then what are the advantages of paying miners directly from that?
Well, not your keys, not your coins. So a Coinbase transaction is the unique transaction in a block where a miner is allowed by the network to pay themselves new coins. And it famously halves every year, plus whatever the transaction fee revenue is they can get into the block. So, I haven't even mentioned Ocean yet, which is like the motivation for all this, and where I work currently. That's a part of Bitcoin proper, is that it allows you in the construction of a block before it gets solved by a miner is to define what addresses those new coins go to. And in every case, the mining pool or the coordinator, which is not the hasher, it's not doing the hashing element of mining, they just pay themselves and then they settle up with their miners from some other source, because you can't even spend those coins for 100 blocks anyway. That's a network imposed limitation. So the fact that they're coming from different sources just adds to the fact that you have no way to do some, look at the blockchain and go, where did my money come from?
Mhm.
Like there's no even expectation of that being somehow related to what happened on chain. It just isn't. And the formula for which it's calculated it's bad on paper, and it isn't even adhered to in practice anyway. So around the halving, you had like blocks with millions of dollars worth of transactions in it because there was like a new wave of spam and just complete ridiculousness. And that miners are like, yeah, we didn't see any of that, or we saw like 20% of what we might have got. And it kind of doesn't work. Like let's go into the weeds of FPPS a little bit here. So FPPS means full pay per share, and it's what 90% of miners expect, which is, I don't want to have to deal with the blockchain. I just want to get paid for mining no matter what. So shield me from the randomness and take what you need to do it. And it's exactly like airport currency exchanges where they tell you it's 0% commission, but you get nothing like what the market rate actually is. So you'll go and mine on one of these pools and it will say, oh, it's 2%, or maybe if you're huge enough, we'll knock you down to 0.5%. And then miners came to our pool and are like, yeah, I'm making like, I don't know, 18% more than I was on a comparative pool. And you guys have had bad luck in this period too. So I'm getting absolutely robbed. And I don't know where that money is coming from or going, but I have no way to really do a link. So FPPS, what it seeks to do is it seeks to establish a value for what you're doing with your hash rate when you're pointing at a pool. And it says, here's what the blockchain's bringing in over the last 144 blocks, not just our pool, but all blocks. And this is how much money's being brought in. And we are finding, 1 block a day, or an 144th of that. You're this much of a percentage of it, so you're owed that much. And if we don't find the blocks, don't worry, we'll pay you anyway. If we find more blocks, we will pocket the difference. And all the randomness is ironed out by having like a large enough middleman that can make the randomness sort of tolerable and make it trend towards, where it wants to go. Like if the bigger the miner, the more variance they can absorb, right? And the pools are effectively taking on the variance there. So FPPS seeks to take a random thing and make it not random, and it's become a thing where it's just an unviable product, because not only is it kind of random anyway, what goes on in the blockchain, but as we transition to transaction fees being what sustains miners away from subsidy, it becomes even less predictable. And the less predictable it is, the harder it is for a miner to verify that they're getting something that relates to what the chain found. And it's already established beyond reasonable doubt that there is no real proper correlation. It's not working the way it should. So this was our contention when we launched Ocean, that there was going to be some invisible commission here and there. And it just turned out to be so much more extreme than any of us really expected. So back to your question about Coinbase transactions, when Ocean has the cash flow issue where if there's no blocks getting found by a pool, you're not getting any money, which is really hard for a miner to hear because it's back to being random and not knowing. But if you're 50% of the pool, when the block gets found, not only are you 50% of the reward, but you're also getting that reward in the block when it gets found. So the money, the second it existed, was already yours. We never took custody of it, which is not your keys, not your coins. And the fact that you can verify with the public stats, which no other pool does, apart from like tiny sort of ethical projects that don't have any real punching power. You can verify that you were 50% of the pool, and you can see the block, and you can verify that you got exactly 50% of the block. You cannot disintermediate any more than that unless you want to go full solo mine. So that being the case, if you inject arbitrary middlemen, the more you do that, the less you're going to get as a split of the block. That's just intuitive, right?
Yeah. No, that's a good framing, actually. And it goes back to that identification of these intermediaries with central banks, because isn't that what
the Cantillon effect?
Well, you were saying too that the way they want to be shielded from uncertainty, and go ahead and take whatever you need to shield me from the uncertainty and just give me this predictable flow of cash. The central bank, right? Its mandates are to keep unemployment low, and to keep the business cycle stable, which it obviously does the opposite, but it's ostensive, or ostensibly it is supposed to shield people from uncertainty, basically, the way you're describing.
Tail ends up wagging the dog, though, right?
But it ends up doing the opposite and really milking people, right? So what is, I guess you're saying here that like Bitcoin's obviously all about sovereignty, but Bitcoin miner sovereignty sounds like it's being compromised in this intermediated model. And you mentioned Ocean, but like, what are the solutions? How do we get Bitcoin mining to adopt more of a traditional Bitcoin ethos?
Well, weirdly, you need people to suffer as a result of not taking their own sovereignty into mind, right? So right now they're suffering a lot. It's just amazingly people don't really seem to care that much. But I'm saying, well, you're losing a lot of money to people that are telling you you're only paying 2%, when in reality they're taking a lot more than 10%. So you're losing money, but that's supposed to be like a thing that mining is sort of characterized as this hyper competitive industry where every penny counts and all that stuff. And I was very disappointed to learn it's not like that game theoretical, isolated vacuum component where every decision is made for economic, it's economically rational. That isn't true. When it comes down to real world stuff, you have legal departments saying, don't do this lucrative thing because it will cost you more in legal expenses than you'll make. So there was one pool that famously started making OFAC compliant blocks. And your naive ideologue in Bitcoin goes, why would you ever censor an OFAC transaction? Because another miner will include it and they'll bring in more revenue than you. And I'm like, because their legal department said if we comply with this, it will save us tens of millions of dollars a year. We don't care about a $3 transaction that's some Iranian on a government blacklist. Like, obviously, the economic rationality has to take into account the wider world,
right?
Not just Bitcoin in a vacuum, right? And when you read the white paper, it is just Bitcoin in a vacuum. It doesn't say, there's horrible tax things as well, where you wanna mine Bitcoin and pay less tax. You can do so if you mine in a government approved manner, which is one of the whole things that terrifies me about Bitcoin becoming a political football with US politics. I'm like, I don't want, like, JFK was my favorite example of something that everyone really liked, that I was like, this sounds like the worst idea I've ever heard, where he said, I want to enshrine it into US law, the right for an American to run a Bitcoin node. And
that was like, RFK.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. So I'm saying, can you imagine anything more horrifying than the US government defining what a Bitcoin node is? Can you think of anything worse than that? I can't. Like, you want to run an alternative client because Core becomes corrupt? You're not legally allowed to do it anymore and it's more expensive. Like, can you imagine that? And most Bitcoiners are like, that's great. Like, yay, pro Bitcoin politicians. I'm like,
is it inevitable though? Like, as Bitcoin becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, I mean, it's going to eat the political sphere too. So like, I see what you're saying, but like, is there any way to avoid this?
I think it just comes down to like human corruption. Make it like, you're going to have centralized exchanges and they are going to make mistakes and get hacked and get robbed. And most of them have, or, have the people inside them run off with everyone's money, or just sheer incompetence, like companies like BlockFi accidentally sending people 750 Bitcoins instead of $750 and then ask for it back, and just hilarious clown stuff like that. Like, you can have, eventually people will just, life comes at you fast, fuck around and find out. People are like, all right, I have to take custody of my coins. And in the mining world, you hope it's the same. Like, I'm so far underwater that I need to switch to a pool that robs me less. But I mean, this is the thing where I said I was disappointed, right? Because it turns out they're not solving for sheer revenue or efficiency or transparency or sovereignty or any of that. It was all cash flow and legal compliance. And then you can say, hey, do you want to make 18% more money? And they'll be like, yeah, but do you have the necessary compliance? Like, we need you to KYC everyone on the pool, or we actually can't take direct custody of what comes out the chain because that changes the tax implication for us. That was the one that horrified me the most. And I don't want to, I think this might be over compliance rather than mere compliance. So I don't want to be telling big people and miners out there that they can't mine with us because there's not enough middlemen involved to make it legal. But from my understanding, the Canadian tax setup was, if you rent hash rate, to some big solo miner, which is basically the setup with the pools at the moment, 15% tax. If you're a Bitcoin miner, which means you get paid out of the chain and you start constructing templates and all that, which is what we need for decentralization, then you need to pay tax when it comes out of the chain, and you've got to pay tax when you convert it as well. So double taxation. And that it basically went, do you want to pay 15% tax or 30% tax? And the 15% one means you're not allowed to touch Bitcoin anymore. You need a third-party custodian that deals with all that for you. And there's one. And there's one in North America, and everyone uses that, and they're completely regulated. They will inspect your facility before you're allowed to mine with them. You have to repeat. You don't just KYC once. You have to keep sending documentation to prove who you are, and anti-money laundering and all this stuff. And that's permissioned, right? And that's Foundry. That's the biggest pool on the pie chart. And I like Foundry, and I know that they don't want to do any of this stuff. They're good actors. But the way they've been forced to act is just classic regulatory capture. Like, if you want to get those advantages and mine more profitably with them, they're still not as profitable as us, I will emphasize, but they are the best FPPS pool. If you want access to that, like, rather than the backwater tiny pools that are FPPS but take way more invisible commission, that we found the best pool was Foundry. If you want to mine with them, KYC. You're not allowed to mine Bitcoin. You've got to be a hash rate rental service, which doesn't allow you to touch stuff when it comes out of the chain. That's regulatory capture. That's classic regulatory moat. Yep. That is economic rationality, means do what the government says. Don't just be a cypherpunk. And that's so different to what mining was back in 2015, right? When if a pool got too big, everyone would just run over to another pool. It was nothing. You can't expect that behavior anymore, and we're all boiling frogs because miners are just increasingly doing what they're told. And this comes right back to centralization versus decentralization. It's not a binary thing. It's a trend. And if Bitcoin is trending towards centralization and mining, that ends in a bad place. It might be all right now, but we know it's getting worse and not better.
Because again, a major component of Bitcoin mining is that individual actors, well, this is Bitcoin more broadly, I guess, individual actors will do what is in their individual best interest. But what you're saying, so there's that sort of traditional notion of homo economicus, right? And they're just going to make rational decisions. But there's rationality or rational considerations that are not just in their own. It's still in their self. This is where it's complicated. It's still in your self-interest in some cases to do what the government tells you to do so you don't get coerced, right? But it's not calculus that goes into the traditional game theory of Bitcoin. So it's almost like a distortion on the purely Darwinian self-preservation game theory, although it's still like another wrinkle into it. Complicated to say the least. But again, something that if Bitcoin is going to succeed at every level seems like something that's kind of inevitable, that those considerations will come into play, obviously, as Bitcoin mining becomes a larger, more mature industry, bigger footprint, bigger part of the tax base, etc. Well, fiat governments are going to come in to get their piece of the action and create all the associated distortions. You mentioned the spectrum, centralization, decentralization. I think this is probably a good time to talk about the difference between Bitcoin and shitcoins, because, well, this has a lot to do with how decentralized Bitcoin is relative to everything else. How do you unpack that for people that maybe aren't as familiar with decentralization? What is the fundamental difference between Bitcoin and shitcoins in the context of what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so I think Bitcoin is, I touched on it already. I think Bitcoin is commonly and falsely viewed as the first, and hence its immaculate conception and all these sort of vaguely blasphemous like things we like to describe it with. It wasn't, right. There's that big history of digital currency attempts, and all of them had some central point of failure. Bitcoin did too, but it was it was more like you'd need to perform social engineering and stuff to destroy it. Like, there wasn't a bank, right, at the beginning. And it trended towards decentralization, and it kept like, blockchain is the worst possible database imaginable. It's so bad, but if you can keep what it's being used for minimal enough, then you have a hope in hell of enough people storing a copy of it it becomes decentralized and then it becomes useful for something.
Yeah.
But so everyone else trying to do features on top of blockchains was like the most bad way you could possibly approach anything. It's like, let's do Uber on the blockchain. It's like, all that's going to do is make everything a million times less efficient, and no one's incentivized to keep copies of it lying around. So all you just have is the world's worst database. Right?
It really only works for money, right?
Yeah.
Because
it only works for one money as well.
Yes.
If it doesn't work with Bitcoin, it's not coming back.
That's
it's
right.
over.
Yeah.
So, so I think, it's about the trend, right? So if you're like, we can bring out more and more features, we can have the world's fastest blockchain, like, and it will cost you $500,000 in equipment to be able to verify it. So no one does, which makes it not even worth your time because you're playing a game that isn't, if you run a Solana node and you actually buy the hardware to do it, like they will just change the rules on you anyway. And then you'll go along with it, or you'll run. I mean, you saw it with Ethereum Classic, right? That was like trying to have a Bitcoin mentality in shitcoin land. And you just get brushed to the side. No one cares about Ethereum Classic, right?
Yeah.
Because that's not what their culture is about.
Right.
Bitcoin culture is about decentralization of rule enforcement, and it actually lives up to that. So that's why we get to be maxis.
Yeah.
That's why we get to have it. It's not it. Everything's downstream from that prioritization, and the block size wars was that. Or the fork wars was that. It was, we can't be making blocks bigger to satisfy people that want to transact. Because the trade-off is that we make life more expensive for people that run nodes, and they are the most important element of this thing. So the fact that won out in the conversation says we have a culture that respects decentralization of enforcement of the rules, not mining, which is decentralized compliance with the rules, right? You've got the people that comply with the rules, and you've got the people that enforce the rules. And again, like if you're playing a game, you're complying with a rule set to play the game properly. But if the rules are only, if it's basketball, right, everyone knows the rules to basketball, so it's worth me getting good at basketball. But if it's like some new game with one person in charge of it, it's not worth becoming good at the rules and spending 10 years practicing it, because it will change, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's where Bitcoin gets its superiority complex from, in my opinion. It's justified and vindicated, but we have to maintain that. So spam is a topic we have coming up. And if you have shitcoin culture come into Bitcoin and go, we don't care about nodes anymore, they're just there if we need them, and they might leave. If you're going to say, all right, they're not just people storing the blockchain because they're incentivized to do it because it's financial history that's relevant to them. If there's a bunch of JPEGs and stuff stored there as well, you're tacking on an additional bit of work for them that they're not paid to do. They're not interested in doing it. It's non-consensual. And it's just fundamentally what an abuse of a protocol looks like. And the miners Bitcoin's game theory doesn't just hold together and perfectly work. That's what the fork wars was. It was literally, these guys want that, but those guys want something else. So we had a war over it. It's not just like Satoshi made a perfect system and now everyone is happy and we all sing Kumbaya and walk off into sunset. There's actual times when we disagree with each other. So this is one of those times, right? Nodes definitely don't want people storing JPEGs on them, and we've made it way more expensive for nodes to run. I don't want to over exaggerate there, but it's worse. Like back in the 2022 era, Raspberry Pi 4 solid state drive, USB connected, 48 hours to sync up from scratch. Now you have the next iteration, Raspberry Pi 5 with an SSD. You want to sync up the network, 110 hours. Okay, a lot worse. And that's after 2 years of growth. We've gone from 48 hours to over 100 hours. If it carries on growing at that rate, you basically kiss that class of hardware goodbye, which is like the $200 node. And that comes from a mindset of shitcoinery that says nodes don't really matter. Miners will mine anyway. They will continue complying with a smaller and smaller group of enforcers to the point where the game starts to become riggable again. That's the trend. And then are you going to have, a network difficulty of 84 trillion, which is how hard it is to find a block right now on average? Are you going to meet that requirement if it's enforced by 60,000 nodes? Demonstrably, yes. 10,000? Probably. 1,000? No way. That's too small, because you can find those 1,000 users and you can say to them, we're going to make all this arbitrary. And we're going to, not only will it be arbitrary, but it will be changeable. And once it becomes realistic to change it, you can't have that high hash rate, that wall, the barrier of energy, whatever Saylor describes it as, right? The encrypted wall of energy. Like, you don't have that anymore. It becomes mushy and soft, and you can just go, all right, I'll get around that. I don't need to get over it anymore.
Right.
So, oh man, I'm going way off.
Is this, no, this is really good though. So Block Wars 2017 hopefully provides some lessons for what we're going through now, which I get. Well, all right. So first question, the Blocksize War of 2017, where again, ostensibly there was a group of Bitcoiners that said we needed larger blocks to put more transactions in each block to make Bitcoin more transactable as a global medium of exchange. The contrarian view to that was, hey, this is an attack on decentralization. You're basically increasing the cost and or difficulty of running a node, which lowers the number of nodes, which compromises decentralization in the way you're describing. Is this another one of those? This is that you're saying this, and I don't know what do we call this? It's gone by ordinals, inscriptions,
runes. There's a lot of different flavors of arbitrary data storage.
But a lot of people say that this is, and this is kind of the camp I've been in up until this point. Like, it's a permissionless system. So if you find another use for it, well, then fucking do whatever you want with it. It's like when I give you a hammer, I don't say you can only build houses with this hammer. Don't build any tree houses or any of this. It's like, I kind of viewed Bitcoin that way, but you're saying this is more like a social attack on Bitcoin in the same way the Blocksize War was in 2017?
Yeah, I think it's a big topic, right? And it's one that Ocean got thrown into because when we launched, we had different mempool policies to what most people have. And they are incredibly easy to defend, but it was due to a general poor understanding in Bitcoin of what people's own nodes do. It looked like an ideological faux pas. So what we did was, we trod on the red exclamation mark tile, right? And it's like, this is censorship, right? All transactions are created equal. And we're like, actually, ideologically, you're actually correct, right? But that is also never how Bitcoin worked. And this just wasn't well understood. So we have a long history, starting with Satoshi, of trying to minimize the amount of arbitrary data that gets made into the Bitcoin blockchain because it's fundamentally not of interest for nodes to store that stuff. So spam filtration, as it was called, was a part of Bitcoin forever. And if you're running a node right now, it's the agreed upon way at the end of the op return wars for us to say, all right, here's how much data you can store that's nothing to do with financial history. Just you want to store data? Here's the default standard for the network. It's not enforced at the consensus level, so you can go outside this if you want to mine your own blocks or pay a miner out of band. But if you want to just use the network and have the efficiency of submitting it to everyone's mempool and having it flood the network, you need to fit within these confines, which limited it to 83 bytes of op return. So if you want 84 bytes of op return, you don't see any of those in the blockchain, even though they're consensus valid, because at the end of the day, getting it in blocks is what you want, but getting it to flood the network is also pretty useful as a way of getting it ultimately in the blockchain. So starting with Satoshi, there was a lot of spam filtration. There's long conversations and threads on Bitcoin Talk between him and Gavin and people and Jeff Garzik back when he was based. It was amazing. And they did a lot of things, and you had Counterparty come along and the same arguments. People saying, we want to store videos and JPEGs inside Bitcoin's blockchain. We want immutability for our data. And funnily enough, it was basically enough to say, we don't want you to do that, go away. And then they went, well, screw you, we'll do it in Ethereum and we'll do it over on other networks. And that was great. It was a happy time. And the actual way Bitcoin Core is designed reflects that. So op return came around as an olive branch saying, look, there's not all arbitrary data storage or spam is created equal. Some of it really hurts Bitcoin. Some of it doesn't really matter. And everything in between that. So ordinals hurt particularly bad because it was an attack on fungibility. They're literally saying 1 Bitcoin does not equal 1 Bitcoin. There's nothing worse than that, right? You can superimpose. That's what KYC is a superimposed interpretation of whether a coin is good or not, right? So people, it's like in the lexicon of Bitcoin that I have my KYC stash and my non-KYC stash. You're literally just saying one Bitcoin does not equal one Bitcoin.
Sure.
At the protocol level, we know they're all equal, which is good, but you can impose an interpretation on top of Bitcoin that seeks to undermine that, which is what ordinals fundamentally do. They say there are these rare sats that are more valuable than other sats. So you start having people pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to get a transaction in the blockchain that only moves one sat. Now that from Bitcoin's theory, that breaks it, because no one is supposed to be doing that. No one is ever supposed to say, hey, I'm going to pay $1,000 to move a single Satoshi. If you're doing that and someone just using Bitcoin in a fungible capacity wants to compete with you in the transaction fee market, they're going to get outcompeted every time. Because I'm never going to spend $1,000 to move anything less than that. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So Bitcoin has no way to counter these kinds of arbitrary interpretations put on top of it. So, but I mean, all that is to say there are different kinds of spam, right? And we settled on one that was like, if you're going to store it, please do it in a way that at least doesn't bloat the UTXO set, which is what op return is. Op return creates provably unspendable outputs. So you can just put text in there if you want. You can put data in there. You can even send sats to an op return output, but then they'll never be spendable. So every time someone puts sats in there, they're dead, and you can remove them from the UTXO set, which is a very expensive part of running a node, is maintaining a UTXO set, because it's the most important part of it, really.
Right.
So, you had these spammers, and they declared themselves attackers. They're like, hey, I want to mess up Bitcoin as much as possible. Mike in Space famously said, inscriptions don't hurt Bitcoin as much as possible. So he did what was called stamps, which were intentionally bloating the UTXO set just to make life difficult, right? You're not going to have, about UTXO management, right? It makes more sense to have one Bitcoin as a UTXO than a million 100 sat UTXOs.
Sure.
Those are unspendable.
From a transaction fee efficiency standpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin sort of assumes you wouldn't create billions and billions of pointless, unspendable UTXOs. So people that want to store data and make fake transactions to sort of shoehorn those transactions in, they don't care about that. So they'll make these dust level outputs, like thousands and thousands of outputs or UTXOs that are only 546 sats. That is a dead, useless UTXO, but they did it so that they could stash a bunch of arbitrary data at the same time. That was expensive to the network overall, and it's why we lost the Raspberry Pi, basically, which is, it's arguable. Some people say, oh, okay, it takes 110 hours now rather than 48. Like that trajectory is unsustainable, right? So when the Raspberry Pi 6 comes out, if we carry on at the rate we have been, it will take you 2 months or 3 months to be able to download the blockchain. It's just worse, right? So that was the stamp spam. And then op return was like the nice way to do it. That was the olive branch we extended. And most of the spam has died now, apart from Runes, which just uses op return, which is the least harmful form of spam there is. It doesn't bloat the UTXO set. It doesn't create loads of dust outputs, and it doesn't even abuse the witness discount either, which is probably, let's not go down that rabbit hole for now.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE.
I want to ask you something. Another perspective I've heard on this previously was that, because there's a saying in Bitcoin, right? Everything's good for Bitcoin, but what I'm hearing you're saying here is that this is not good for Bitcoin, right? This is an attack.
Centralization is not good for Bitcoin, right?
Centralization is not good on Bitcoin. This is an attack on again, the cost and or complexity of running a node. So therefore, this would reduce number of nodes and reduce decentralization quality of Bitcoin over time. The other perspective I'd heard on this previously was that all of these attacks or this bloating, this data bloat, if you will, on the Bitcoin blockchain will just drive more demand for higher order protocol development, layer 2, 3 plus.
It does do that.
Okay, so how does that play into this then? It's like if you were talking about spending $1,000 to send a SAT, doesn't that just push everyone into the Lightning Network or equivalent?
In theory,
Yeah.
you'd hope so. But I mean, in practice, again, like I try and be ruthlessly pragmatic when it comes to Bitcoin, which is why I find myself, at odds with people that take ideological positions.
Mhm.
And I was talking to, Giacomo Zucco is one of my favorite Bitcoiners. And he's famously idealistic, right? We'll keep everything, as morally close to ideal libertarian cypherpunk ethos that spawned this. And I was talking to him the other day with kind of an identity crisis in it, because I'm constantly being what feels like a moral relativist or a pragmatist. And I'm saying, but I keep coming back to this way of doing it. And I think that's how Satoshi operated anyway. And Giacomo said, yeah, I think my approach to things means I would never have been able to make Bitcoin, because there's constant moral and ideological compromises just to make something functional. And Satoshi was the ultimate pragmatist, because he never solved the Byzantine generals problem. He just came up with a system that makes it impractical for people to reorganize and rewrite history. The Byzantine generals problem, when he presented the white paper, everyone laughed at him and said, you think you've solved an unsolvable theoretical problem. And he's like, well, you're right. I haven't, but watch. And
But it incentivized people to cooperate under those conditions, even though he didn't technically solve it.
Yeah.
He socially solved it. Something
you
like
can
that.
rewrite the blockchain from block 2 if you want. It's just no one's actually going to.
Right.
So on a practical level, he did it. But on a theoretical level, no, he didn't.
That's
and
interesting.
That was such a pragmatic approach. And he would move fast and break things all the time, right? And it would go against ideology to do it. But this is ultimately what it comes down to with spam. You cannot talk about spam with ideologues, because there is no philosophical definition for spam.
Right.
One man's spam is another man's valid transaction.
Right.
And in fact, they are all valid. Spam by definition in any context is always protocol valid.
It's just data.
If you break the rules of email, you're not going to get in people's spam folders. They're valid emails.
Right.
But the point is they make email unusable. And if you keep getting phone calls from people that aren't who you want to get phone calls from, phone becomes unusable. And if the blockchain is full of stuff that isn't financial data, intentionally done so by people that call themselves attackers, and you're too ideological to separate the difference, even when they're making it easy for you and saying, we want to attack Bitcoin, we want to make the UTXO set totally unwieldy, and we want to make it so that everyone is, we'll get onto what happens as an effect for financial users. If you're going to be ideological about it, then you cannot have a concept for spam.
Yeah.
But I'm saying it's a shared protocol, and you can always have use of a protocol or abuse of a protocol. My analogy for it that I liked using was, you have a road, you have people driving down it, it floods one day, and people start sailing boats down it, and they like sailing boats down it, and then they start intentionally flooding the road to make it more usable for boats. And they're saying, this is freedom, man. Like, how do you get to define a car or a boat? Like, there's a wheel on my boat, or like, they can start like playing games like that. And you're like, fair enough. It is all transport. It is all people moving from A to B. But this was not the actual purpose of this piece of infrastructure. And you know what happens in that world? There are just no more cars, because there's no reliable roads. And when there's no more cars, the roads stop as well. There are no more roads. So it's funny to be talking about roads in the context of like libertarian ideology.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, look, if you want to abuse the Bitcoin protocol and use it as generic cloud storage for massive redundancy of tens of thousands of people that are going to store your JPEG for the rest of the time, ultimately how that ends is the whole system just kind of dies. Because no one is motivated to use it the way you're using it. It doesn't internally self-reinforce anymore.
But doesn't that, before you get to the outcome of the whole system dying, doesn't that just lead to another contentious hard fork?
Yeah, but I mean, there's only so much of them we can do, right? Like, we know we have to hard fork anyway. But with enough consensus, a hard fork.
Oh, so this is already inevitable in your book.
I mean, no, actually, maybe I'm wrong. Like, it's generally understood that the Unix time thing, I can't even remember the proper definition for it. I'm pulling a blank, but we'll run out of digits there's a kind of millennium bug built into Bitcoin where we just run out of digits for time. I think it's 2096. But I think Luke now has found a way to do it with a soft fork. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we don't actually have to hard fork. But that was for a long time, people's thing was, well, Bitcoin has to hard fork because we don't have enough digits for the time to keep increasing and we'll reset. So I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have the right answer there because Luke now thinks we can fix it with a soft fork, which might mean there's never a hard fork.
Right. Well, okay. If let's, I guess, assume then the spam is an attack on decentralization, there doesn't seem to be a viable way to stop it that's non-ideological right now. So then in that, assuming those things are correct, do we end up in a contentious hard fork?
No, because I think it's fixable.
Okay.
And the reason I think that is because we've always been anti-spam. Since Satoshi was around, we always had spam filtration as a concept. And I think it's quite realistic to fix it, which is why I support doing it. It seems like kind of David Goliath, unwinnable battle, but it's not something we can afford to just turn a blind eye to, right? So like I said, phone calls, email, other communication mediums, you would never, ever abandon the concept of spam filtration, even though you can't strictly define it. And like my email has Bitcoin in the address, right? So imagine how many spam folders I end up in when I email people. That's just part of using email. And if there was no spam filtration made, if there was no effort to do that, email would just be unusable, right? And same with phone calls, same with Bitcoin, right? If you're trying to outcompete people that are using Bitcoin as an arbitrary data storage thing with financial transactions that have a stricter set or subset of situations in which it makes sense to use Bitcoin, then you're going to continually get outcompeted before you even talk about, inequality for use of the witness discount, which makes it worse, unfortunately. So witness data is discounted versus non-witness data. That was part of how SegWit was designed, and it was supposed to incentivize people consolidating UTXOs, ironically, because it kind of had the opposite effect, because people are using that witness data to upload arbitrary data, but also pay only a quarter of the fee for what they're doing there. So,
so this then an unforeseen consequence of SegWit?
Very much.
Oh,
so.
wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And it's, again, it gives us pause for thought about like Sailor's wisdom when he's talking about we got perfect money and you only get to play God once. When we do these upgrades, things happen that we could never have thought about. And people are so clever, right, that they forget how stupid people can be. So if people are falling for JPEGs and NFTs and all that stuff, those can be gamified and people can like attend the casino and there's a never-ending faucet of clown world money funding the thing.
Wow.
Like arbitrary data storage in Bitcoin isn't a problem unless you gamify it and market it to the point where there's millions of idiots literally thinking they can own pictures of frogs and stuff. That starts to become, on a practical level, it's like you've made the network unusable. It's not ideologically, nothing has changed, but the chain is full of crap and no one is transacting on the base layer because it's too expensive and the L2s aren't ready yet. So your question is like, aren't we motivating like Lightning and the development of higher protocols and things like that? Yes, we are on paper, but bad habits become entrenched and Bitcoin is not ready for people to all be onboarded to layer 2s, right? Like El Salvador came around late enough that it just about worked that they could all onboard direct to Lightning. But is anyone in El Salvador actually running a Lightning node and managing their own channels? Zero. Everyone is just using LSPs to do it for them. And at that point, that's centralized. The LSPs of today are the Google and the Facebook and the big data of tomorrow, right? They surveil everyone's transactions. Everything requires their permission. That's no good. That's permissioned Bitcoin. And in that world, this is where the big blockers were right. 21 million doesn't mean anything because it all exists in off-chain databases. So the big blockers are right about their concerns with no one being able to use it as a medium of exchange in a sovereign manner. They just weren't right with their solution of just keep making blocks bigger and don't worry about the trade-offs. So, but we can't dismiss their concerns because they're right. Like if everyone's using Bitcoin through third parties, that just turns into gold, because gold is like impractical as a medium of exchange. So how much gold is there? I don't know. The bank tells me there's X amount.
Right.
Like,
yeah. You destroy the portability of Bitcoin when you make it. You make it so cost prohibitive, I guess, to move it around that it becomes like gold again.
Yeah, it becomes wide open. Like ETFs are 6102able.
Yeah.
You know, and this is the problem with spam. It's prematurely putting us in a position where people can't afford to use a chain. It's kind of all died. Like the chain is really cheap again right now. So I don't want to be, it's kind of convenient and inconvenient for my position, because on the one hand, the fire has gone out and I'm not running around with my hair
for now.
But yeah.
But it blazed up pretty quickly the first time.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it's not really about, a lot of people think it's just I don't like NFTs or I think these are scams or anything. That's kind of a distraction. It's just Bitcoin needs to be used for its intended purpose, and the way it the culture around
that's the
it.
phrase I think that's tricky right there, though, because it's hard to square that or reconcile that with permissionless system.
For sure.
When you say intended purpose, and it's like, wait a minute, I thought Bitcoin was permissionless money.
Again, though, on a practical level, what the culture wants influences what the developers optimize for. So if you want to optimize Bitcoin for arbitrary data storage, that wouldn't happen. In fact, we did the opposite, and we pushed them into various use cases. And if you want to flip that on its head and fill it with people like migrants from Ethereum and all these lands, where they come over and they go, right, we want to do shitcoins on Bitcoin, right? And that's what the whole Nashville conference was celebrating, right? All this shitcoinery.
I know this.
Well, if that becomes a big contingent of Bitcoin's culture, how do we start getting in upgrades that optimize for transaction density, right? Like governance upgrades, like if you can condense, if you can create more economic density, which is what the L2s claim to do, right? You can, if your on-chain footprint is really a manifestation of a Lightning channel, which was an economic relationship spanning 5 years with billions of transactions in it. If your competing use case is, I need to be able to store arbitrary data on chain, I don't want to outcompete an economic might that size, you're naturally, if you're clever, you're against those upgrades, right? So that leads to premature ossification. This is this is the theory of it. In practice, the governance upgrades are all being pushed for by the spammers, and I haven't really managed to figure out why that is, if I'm honest with you, because it works against what they're doing. But either way, Bitcoin core development is downstream of what Bitcoin's culture wants, and we're going to change and we're going to optimize. And these are all decisions around, like, do I block the drain and make it so that the road keeps flooding and boats can go down it? Like, at the end of the day, they're decisions that will result in certain kinds of user behavior. It's permissionless, but like, again, it's like, it's permissionless. I get to drive my car anywhere I want. That's not the same as roads are permissionless, therefore I get to flood it and ride boats down it and make it unusable for cars. Like, it's again, it's just like, I don't know how to tie it back to free speech, but at the end of the day, like, you create.
Is that not what the forking is for, though? Like the forks. So to maybe not stretch the analogy too much, but if you've got the road that's being flooded and people are like, I just want to drive my fucking car on this road, don't they just fork and say, you can't flood this road? And then that becomes the new Bitcoin if social consensus is established that people want to drive cars down the road rather than drive boats down the road?
Yeah, I think so. But then you get into the weeds of what's a boat and what's a car. How do you really separate it? And that's why you can't.
Now we're starting to sound like wokist.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, it's hard to define. And I think that's why you do it at the mempool level. You don't do it at the consensus level.
All right, so tell me about that then. So what you're saying at the mempool, I guess, first of all, define mempool for people. And then when you say mempool level, this means it's not built into Bitcoin itself. This is the users of Bitcoin establishing a policy?
Yeah, so it's like, every single person, imagine for a minute they're all toll roads. And we're like, the road, fundamentally what the road is capable to handle a boat going down it. But every single person that is operating the gates at the entrance to all these toll roads isn't practically going to let that kind of vehicle enter. So you won't see them on roads, even though technically they can still do it. That's as opposed to like reinventing the laws of physics and changing what a road is. Like,
is it gatekeeping?
Yes.
Wow.
I'll call it gatekeeping, but
which is another wrinkle, because that's usually anti-Bitcoin ethos.
Sure, but I mean, we have we would be breaking precedent if we stopped. That was kind of where the whole rationale came from for me. And I'm like, wait, this system is way more pragmatic than I gave it credit for. Again, like ideologically, I cannot argue with your position. You're correct. But it's also never what we did, because we've had spam filters forever and they've always been respected. And then they broke with the combo of SegWit and Taproot, and people started uploading entire JPEGs. And we're like, oh, we just need to fix them and make them what they were. And everyone's like, that's ideologically incorrect. And I'm like, you're right, but it's what we've always done and it's always worked and no one ever complained about it.
Is the answer to reverse out of SegWit and Taproot?
No, I think that cat's well and truly out of the bag. And like without, I mean, you'd have to come up with another fix for malleability in order to have Lightning.
That's right. Yeah.
Like SegWit was a very necessary upgrade.
Yeah.
You can get rid of the witness discount. I know Luke disagrees with me strongly on that, but I don't like it. The witness discount creates two classes of transactions, one which is cheaper than the other. And that's sort of bit us in the ass with this, because, you know, JPEG storage is cheaper than financial transactions. So that's not free market winning out, right? That's literally a rigged system where it's cheaper for one guy than it is for the other. That sucks. That doesn't work. That doesn't even work in the ideologue head, right?
Man, it's so complicated. I mean, the visual is like the guy trying to patch the leaky dam, and you patch one hole and two more leaks spring out over here. And it's just, I mean, we're just playing with a very large and complex system, right? And the trade-offs and unforeseen consequences are difficult to navigate.
I think you're always going to chase your tail with it, but you can't stop.
Yeah.
To me, it's like weeding a garden. Like if you don't do it, your garden's screwed.
Right.
But you know there's always going to be another weed.
So you just got to do it forever. Yeah.
Like that's where it gets ideological, and I'm like, you can't be ideological about spam, because you will never stop spam. But if you just go, well, then I won't do anything about it, I'm like, then you will be overrun with weeds and you won't have anything nice anymore. Like it's this constant game of cat and mouse that every other protocol will like, yeah, we just have to do this, and it's annoying, and someone will get through that shouldn't, and someone will get filtered that was doing the thing they weren't spammers, right? That's just life. Like, and again, there is no watertight component or definition for it. Everyone will say, okay, define spam then. And I'm like, I can't. I confess that. But I also know that if we don't attempt to filter it like we always have, we're going to end up just overrun with garbage.
That's very confusing. You say you can't define it. How can you filter something you can't define?
You can do it because it gets done on a person-to-person basis.
So the individuals using the system get to set their own filtration parameters.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an element of Bitcoin that's super centralized, which is everyone uses one implementation, Bitcoin Core.
Yeah.
So when Bitcoin Core set spam fault filters with a default setting, everyone just uses that.
Right.
And then you never see spam that's outside of that. So the one I mentioned is 83 bytes of op return. It's not a consensus thing. You can have 10,000 bytes, I think, is the consensus limit for op return. You'll never see that in blocks, because if I want to do that, if I want to create a transaction and it is valid that has 10,000 bytes of op return, I have to find a miner, I have to pay them out of band to get that in the chain, or I can just make it 83 bytes and then submit it to the whole network as a standard transaction, and it will propagate like normal. Like there's an advantage to using the flood fill nodes that are out there. Like we don't just hand our transactions to miners and then it ends up in the chain like magic. That's not how you broadcast a transaction in Bitcoin. Your node talks to, 11 other nodes, and they talk to 11 other nodes, and it floods the network, and then miners pick it up. There's an efficiency there. So when people say, oh, you can get spam in no matter what the mempool filters are set to, I'm like, yeah, but try. And this was really fun, actually. We had a nice demonstration of this, because everyone's they're being overly philosophical with it. So everyone's like, it doesn't matter what you do with the spam filters, it's still consensus valid, so it's still going to end up in a chain no matter what you do. And Francis Pouliot showed up on Twitter again, just had a kid, and was like, I'm done with this app. He came on that day and was like, please send 100 sats to this address, and then just deleted Twitter again and disappeared. And then everyone's like, of course we can. And they spent like 5 days trying to do it, because they had to find a miner that they could actually submit a transaction directly to, just to prove the point. And the fact that it was so inefficient made me go, right, there's an extra expense there when you don't just get to freeload off nodes. Like I will accept stuff that is rational for me to accept as a node runner, and that is not pages and pages of JPEGs. There's no rationale for me doing that. It's rational for a miner to include it in the chain because they get paid, but it's not rational for a node user to want to relay it. That's not my job, and I'm not even paid for what it is. It's an accidental artifact of Bitcoin that you have lots of node users. And it's always been an uphill struggle getting enough people to run nodes to be able to claim decentralization. Right. But if you start mission creeping and being like, oh, add all this stuff, they're going to get annoyed and they're going to be less motivated to do it. And it's sort of, that moves into tragedy of the commons territory.
Yeah. So, all right.
That's a big topic and it's not strictly related to Ocean. So.
No, of course. But the big theme here, we're talking about dangers to the centralization or dangers to the decentralization of Bitcoin, which is another way of saying, as you said at the beginning, Bitcoin has started centralized in the mind of Satoshi. It's become very decentralized. Well, probably the most decentralized thing we have, definitely in terms of money, the most decentralized digital money we have. Maybe you could argue gold is more decentralized as physical. I don't know. But now you're identifying certain dangers that could cause it to regress. Hardware manufacturing is one. We've sort of alluded to that earlier. You talked about mining pools, but nodes is an interesting one. Another way Bitcoin's been described is like a system of very aligned incentives, or near, what did I say? It's like a vortex of positive incentives that causes itself to proliferate, right? It's basically paying everyone to make it succeed.
Yeah.
But one area, well, maybe two areas where this is weak is nodes. There's not a very direct financial incentive for people to run nodes. There is maybe an incentive in the sense if they want to avoid being scammed or rug pulled or sent false transactions, some technical reasons to run a node.
Privacy is a good one.
Privacy. And then the other one was Bitcoin developers. Like although there have been some workarounds for this, right? Like people creating funds and whatnot. These seem to be maybe two weak points in terms of Bitcoin's positive incentive schema. What do you think the fixes are to those, to getting more people to run nodes, and if you agree with them, and getting more people to be Bitcoin developers?
Yeah, so it's been a cultural trope to run a node, right? And it became kind of a virtue signal and a bit cringe as well, because if you don't use your node, it doesn't really do anything, right? So, but it was a big thing. Like we did fight a war over it and we did win that war, kind of. Like there's a caveat there, but we basically did. The right guys won in 2017. Incentivizing node running is difficult because you don't get paid for it. You're just supposed to do it for your own benefit. But expecting people to understand the benefit, like it's like that thing, like the market is, assumes people make economically rational decisions, but that people make economically irrational decisions. They do it all the time.
Yeah.
And some of that can be because it's morally, like, that morality plays into people's decisions too. So people will spend more on a product that's more ethical, right? That's not economically rational, but it's another factor. So getting people to run nodes is hard, and getting people to use their nodes is even harder still because the ecosystem just doesn't lend itself to it. Nonetheless, by grace of God, we have enough people running nodes to be able to genuinely claim decentralization. So, I mean, and when it comes to core development as well, that's I'm not going to get into it because that's fraught with issues too. But it is what it is.
Fraught with issues in terms of not having enough developers.
Just more like the expectations versus reality. Like I did a poll on Twitter recently where I said Bitcoin Core is a meritocracy. It's immune from politics. I created a deliberate straw man. It's immune from politics. Not a single line of code gets in there unless it is reviewed and vetted and found to be, correct and what it should be. And most people voted yes, and it's not true at all, right? Like, of course, there's social heuristics getting used. Most people aren't reviewing it. If one guy proposes it, everyone just acts it, which is like approved on GitHub. If someone people don't like recommends it, then it gets downvoted. And that's just like people, right? Like, let's not be naive and think there's no politics in core development. Of course there is. Like,
sure.
So I just sort of was like, whoa, people are we're high on our own supply a bit when it comes to how decentralized and how much of a meritocracy it really is. I just think that was, I still think core development's pretty good, but I just think we think it's better than it is, right?
Right.
Like let's be honest with ourselves, right? It's the way funding works is super centralized. The way mining is getting is incredibly centralized, and that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And you have a trend towards centralization in certain areas of it. So you have to pick up on those and not become boiled frogs, in my opinion.
What then so the big theme is, again, dangers to Bitcoin's decentralization. It's been on a really good path so far. Maybe it's starting to regress along these certain verticals or domains, whatever you want to call it. How do we check that? How do we reverse course? What are you guys doing at Ocean to push the decentralization of Bitcoin further? Like, what should people be thinking about? It's very easy to just say, oh, we've got Bitcoin and it's decentralized and
Yeah, sure.
we're done here. It's like, well, that's not the case. It's an ongoing process. It's a garden that we always have to weed. Like, what particular spots of the garden should people be paying attention to?
Yeah, so great topic. So there's been a conflation of hashing, which is a part of the mining process, and mining, which is more than just hashing. So the process of Bitcoin mining is in its entirety is running a node, downloading and verifying the entire chain, creating a template for a new block that builds on top of the longest proof of work chain, having a mempool, finding unconfirmed transactions and using them to populate the block, then hashing, where you try and solve the block, which is the number guessing part of it. Then if you get lucky and solve the block, submit it to the network and you've just added one block to the chain. That hashing part is what people that call themselves Bitcoin miners do, but the rest of it is done by a tiny group of people, and that's not harmless. That's a choke point, and it's become incredibly centralized, and it's much worse than it looks, is the main thing I'm sounding the alarm about, because these are the people that decide what goes in the blockchain. That's not an innocuous thing, and you can't just rely on top-down lucrative motivations of we'll run a mempool and we'll start with the most lucrative transaction, go down from there until we fill up the block, and then we'll keep iterating on that every few seconds as new transactions come in. We'll just substitute in any low-paying one with a higher-paying one. Oh, we found a block. Like, that's a very naive heuristic. If the person doing that is a regulated giant entity inside the United States, the idea that they will continue doing that and respect neutrality of Bitcoin transactions is incredibly low. That's something that might work for a while, but it's not something we can say we've built a resilient, anti-fragile system if we're relying on one party to be like, everything that goes in the chain is dictated by me. And once I make these templates that aren't blocks, right? They haven't done the proof of work, the hashing component, but they've still designed what goes in the chain. They send it out to all their miners or hashers who then solve the block, and if they get lucky, it gets added to the chain. But the hasher, the one doing the proof of work, didn't have any say or interest or concern even about what ended up in that block. They were completely removed from that element of mining. So it's not a tragedy. It's not the end of the world. And Bitcoin demonstrably works at the moment anyway, but that's not a resilient system. Like I said, there's no redundancy there, because if and when someone comes and holds a gun to the head of this tiny group of people that are deciding what goes in the chain, there's nowhere else for miners really to go. They're captured, they're stuck in the places they're forced to use. They're addicted to this payout model where the person constructing those also smooths out their revenue. They've become very addicted to that, and they've become completely unconcerned with the process of template construction, which needs to be decentralized, right? So you have massive decentralization of hashes. They're all around the planet, but they're all getting put through this funnel, gatekeeping, as you put it, of here's what goes in the blockchain. And it's basically dictated by, I think 90% of blocks are what comes out of them and what goes into them is dictated by 3 pairs of hands, which is obviously centralized. And the fact that that's not a concern tells me that, to me, that's like saying it doesn't matter if PayPal deplatform me because you have Venmo, you have Cash App, you have alternatives. I'm like, that's not a resilient, redundant system. That's just hopping around from centralized service provider to service provider. That's not redundancy. That's not decentralization. That's way harder. Like you could run Bitcoin with one node, right? And that's what shitcoiners do. They're like, it's good enough. We didn't get shut down. I'm like, yeah, but that's not credible, right? You need like tens of thousands of them. So every miner should be also responsible for designing blocks and seeing what goes in there. And my fantasy for this is just, you want to come along, your US government or your Chinese government pointing a gun at Bitmain's head, or your US government pointing a gun at Foundry's head, which is already over 50% of the network, just the combination of those two. What I want is, currently it's the world where they say, we want you to exclude this or comply with this transaction blacklist or something like that. Right now, if they did it, there'd be backlash and the community would be very annoyed with them, but it would be a real thing they could actually do. In the world we're building, which are pretty close to, where all of the miners individually participating on those pools are all constructing templates locally rather than getting the pool to do it for them. In that world, it becomes a joke. Rather than a naughty thing you shouldn't do that's against the ethos of Bitcoin, but you can do it, it becomes a joke. Like, oh, wow, this guy is censoring transactions. Amazing. There's 10,000 other people that are just as likely to find a block as them who aren't going to do that. So then it becomes laughable, right? And it's like, you can't, the Second Amendment doesn't give everyone a nuclear bomb, but it does give everyone a rifle. Like that's relatively decentralized, right? And that has consequences. It does, it does make things freer. It does make us more sovereign because it's like, it's simple enough and it's distributed enough that it's like credible. So you want every miner doing the whole mining process, and then mining's decentralized. That's what you want. And we're not far away from it. It's going to be beautiful when it comes out. Every single block on it, because you look at the timeline on mempool.space, and you'll see like Foundry, Antpool, Foundry, Antpool, F2Pool, via Foundry, Antpool.
This is
Foundry.
the sequence of who's solved the most recent blocks.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
You'll just look at these same actors, find the same pools. And what makes it really bad is so many of the small pools that are supposed to give us some decentralization are all just Antpool under the hood. And they're not really hiding it all that well, but the fact that they're hiding it at all suggests that, they're acting in their own interests, and their own interests are against the interests of the wider network, which is fine. But in the past, people would migrate away from them if they did that, and they're not doing that now, which is why I say we have boiling frog syndrome.
Wow. What? So do you see this? I mean, if what you're describing is true, then this model would eat Bitcoin mining over time, right? Because why would anyone go to one of these? Do I call them centralized pools? Is that what they are today?
Well, they present the best cash flow. That's why they go there, and they also satisfy some regulatory.
But they're getting milked, though, right? I mean, to pick up that certainty and pay for that shield against the uncertainty, they're paying a tax or some fee that sounds like it's hard to calculate.
They're definitely losing a lot of money.
They're losing money. So if that were true and they had the option, and maybe it takes a while for this knowledge to permeate people's mind and get out there, but at some point, if this were all true, presumably everyone would switch to this model and away from the existing smooth payout model.
Yeah. I think most people's intuition is that if I do this thing that's better for Bitcoin, it's going to come at the cost of my bottom line. That is people's usual intuition, right? Like the decentralized model is going to be less efficient because that's just the nature of decentralization, and I'm going to make less money. Weirdly, that's not the case. Weirdly, if you come and do what helps Bitcoin out, you also earn more money. The too good to be true element comes in with the fact that the transparency of what we do and the fact that we only pay miners when we find blocks as a result means cash flow gets disrupted. Like we will go, because we're tiny at the moment, we will go multiple days without blocks, and that's going to be annoying for miners to deal with. And I think right now a lot of them are rational, not jumping on our pool. Fair enough. But if we're 3 or 4x the size we are now, which should be in the process of happening, it's kind of like a party. Like no one wants to be the only guy at the party. Like you need how many people is a party? I don't know.
Yeah, right. No one was just saying in commercial real estate, never be the first guy on the block kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Does this model then preclude the possibility of a collaborative structure where people can have smoother payouts? Is it binary?
No, it doesn't, because it gets very smooth pretty quick.
Okay.
So right now we're at 1.2 exahash, which is tiny, right? It's like 0.1% of the entire network. So we're finding blocks pretty rarely. But it already trended and hit 100% of expectations, because you'll fall below 100% of the blocks you expect, and you'll go above it, and you should trend towards 100%. Occasionally, you're not going to fit that, and you'll deviate from it because difficulty adjustments happen. And if you get unlucky in one and then the difficulty jumps up, you might never make that back. But regardless, you need to be finding, I don't know, I'm going to say like at least 10 or 11 blocks every epoch, right? Otherwise, you might just miss out on low difficulty periods. So there's a minimum size a pool can be before it's practical. That's why you can't just have 10,000 mining pools and we decentralize everything that way. Doesn't work. Like a pool needs to step up, be big enough, but also be transparent and non-custodial to the point where the miners, if they all use that pool, aren't a systemic risk to Bitcoin. So if everyone's mining on Ocean, doesn't matter. The miners are basically solo mining because they're all constructing their own templates, and as many of them as possible are getting paid out from the Coinbase. So there isn't some giant entity that is designing everything that goes in the chain and taking custody of everything that comes out of it. That's centralization, right? We cannot have that. And Ocean breaks all of that. It just says all we do is coordinate splits. So you're 20%, you did 40% of the work, you did 10% of the work, and the remaining 30%, if I did the numbers right, we'll split that accordingly. We'll define how the Coinbase split works. We don't do anything else. We don't construct the block template. We don't take custody of the coins coming out. And if someone holds a gun to our head, there's nothing we can do. We could screw with one block and annoy everyone and go out of business, and that would be the end of it. Someone would just do an alternative, and hopefully we would have raised the bar for what's acceptable in Bitcoin, which is I'm a miner, but I demand my pool not take custody of my coins, and I demand that everything they do is transparent. I'm not going to accept anymore mining for a pool that doesn't give me any insight into how what I did relates to what I was paid. That's not good enough. And if they take custody of all new coins as well, that's a risk to me I could do without. Like I'm a Russian miner, I'm a Kazakhstan miner, and I'm using an American pool. I don't know. There's at the end of the day, there's not that much buffer where the pool can really rob you that bad. But it just comes down to that addiction again to continuous positive, deterministic cash flow where you're just like, I can't verify this and I'm losing more and more and more. And as I said, the variety of transaction fee revenue, the variance of that means these guys offering to get rid of all the randomness for you have to take such a big cut of it to not go out of business that it becomes economically unviable. And I think it's slowly happening. Like we've had 5 miners now. We had our biggest miner, our second biggest miner, and our third biggest miner give us their numbers and all say, yeah, we're getting, and scientifically point exactly the same amount of machines at 3 or 4 other FPPS pools. I never name them because I don't want to get in trouble. But commonly used pools that everyone uses that pay out the FPPS model. And in all cases, they were more than 10% more with us. And that was exacerbated by the fact that we got unlucky. Ocean got unlucky in December, and it got unlucky around the halving, which were the 2 highest transaction fee periods in Bitcoin's entire history. We're still below 100% luck, so we found less blocks than we expected. 3 of our blocks were empty, which happens every now and again, but that was absurdly lucky because empty blocks happen when you find a block like 2 seconds after the last network block. It's luck, but it's luck to the point where it actually gets unlucky. So 3 of our 39 blocks were empty, which was just like absurdly unlucky. And we don't include some spam as well. And the contention was if you don't include some of the spam, you're going to make your miners less money. So all of these factors together meant we should have been at least equal to other pools, if not worse. And instead we were over 10% better, depending on which miner we're talking about. And that was insane to us. I'm like, wow, our theory was that there's a lot of invisible penny pinching. And actually, if maybe I can make this one analogy I'd like to make. To me, it was like drilling for oil. And you can either go there and drill for oil and be part of a team and like take from the well directly, or you can be at the end of a 8,000 mile pipeline and just take stuff as it comes out. And you have no idea who's siphoning what off along the way or what went into it in the first place. You just can't know that. And you can have someone tell you, but then you have to trust that person. So with us, you're mining at the well. The blockchain, the minute there's a block, that's your money, right? With the other pools, it's okay, yeah, we find blocks, but there's nothing to do with what we're paying you. And there's like a convoluted process by which we calculate it. So that analogy should hold true. Like if you want the most amount of crude oil, you've got to be at the oil field. You cannot be at the end of thousands of miles of pipeline because you're never going to get something that is equal to what was put into it. No way.
I think that's a great analogy and a great place to drop it.
All right.
Mr. Bitcoin Mechanic, thanks for coming to Miami.
Thanks for having me, man.
Good to have you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.